All right, I can see the numbers of people shooting up here, so we must be getting going. Hello, welcome everyone. This is going to be a great chat today. I'm Frances Cook. I am the investment editor for Business Desk, and we're going to be talking today death, money, and the future. Frankly, that's the trifecta of things that people usually avoid talking about, and yet it's really important that we do. We need to know ahead of time things like, what do I want when I die? What about when someone in my family dies? What happens to the house? What about any unpaid mortgage that's left? And also, what about sentimental things like mum's jewelry? There's also lots of important decisions that don't revolve around stuff, like what funeral plans are in place, and do my parents or partner even want a funeral? Who should pay for it? And you actually don't even need to have died to have these tough decisions come up. You might be incapacitated. Who do you want to make tough decisions for you? Who will look after the kids? Or even who will look after the dogs? Also very important. Then there's the usual problems, like how much do we need to have saved for retirement? Whether we have a plan for if we lose our job. I mean, look, I might have just rattled off a whole list of problems that have really freaked you out. But even though it can sound a little bit doom and gloom, these conversations are actually harder to have if you haven't thought about them before things go wrong. And public trust estimates, more than 50% of New Zealanders don't have a will, and only 17% have an enduring power of attorney. So we do need to plan for our future and to protect not only ourselves, but our loved ones too. And the good thing is that there are solutions to help you take some of that power back, make this conversation a little less freaky. So on that note, I'm here today with three experts today as part of Money Week. We have Glenys Talivai, who is the CEO of Public Trust, who can talk to the importance of protecting your legacy, the barriers that might get in the way, and what can happen when plans aren't in place. We also have Tom Hartmann, who is the personal finance lead at sorted.org.nz. We'll talk about things like financial planning, both now and for your retirement. Last but never least, Dr. Ayesha Scott, Senior Lecturer at AUT Business School, who will talk about why these conversations and topics are so hard and offer tips about having these conversations with loved ones. And for those who joined us a little bit later, I am Frances Cook. I am the investments editor for Business Desk, and I will be guiding our conversation today. We're also going to be taking your questions, so drop those into the chat space. Do not miss this chance to have the experts help you out. Until then, though, let's dive in. Glenys, let's start with you. Why do you think it's so important to have these difficult conversations about, tough topics, death, money, the future?
Well, I mean, the reality is that those topics don't really, the fact that we don't lean into those conversations easily in New Zealand really doesn't bode well for what we are seeing as increasingly complex scenarios around people's estates when unfortunately they pass away. And so, thinking ahead about what's going to happen with your eventual death, I hate to say it, people, unfortunately, one day we're all going to die. And it's frightening and terrifying and not something that we like to think about a lot at all, but it will happen. And so really thinking about, so what do I want to have happen? As you said earlier, Frances, not just about with our assets, the house, the money that we might have, but who will look after our children, our pets, who are almost like the is important to us as children, but equally too important tonga that we might have, or other really precious sentimental things that, it's about letting your loved ones know this is what I want to have happen. And then most importantly, putting in place the legal documents that sets that out so that it's really clear under the law what it is that you wish to have happen. And as you said earlier, only half of us adult New Zealanders actually put that in place, have actually got a will in place right now. So really it's leaving a lot to chance, and it's leaving a lot to others to decide for you. That, whilst they might have the best intentions, if you haven't made it clear, what they think just might not be quite as you had imagined it. Equally, too, if you die without a will, then the law decides what happens. It's very clear under the Administrations Act what's going to happen there, and that might again not be quite as you might like it, or as you had envisioned. So that's why it's so important to lean into it. Equally, if it's not just about what you want to have happen, but I know for me, when my parents came to me and said, hey G, we want to talk to you about what's going to happen when we die, it's like, oh mum, dad, I can't have this conversation with you, because facing into the reality that your parents might die is equally scary. Yet, what I realized is that it's really important that I do know what they want and what they want to have happen, because it's actually fundamentally important to most people that I want to make sure that I honour their legacy and what they've left behind and everything that they've achieved. And how am I going to do that if I don't know what it is that they want? And so, it's very complex, it's very difficult, but it's too important to leave these things to chance, is probably why it's just so important to lean into it.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people have assumptions about what will happen if they die without a will. What does happen, Glenys, if you die without a will? What's sort of the de facto of what happens there?
So what happens is that, depending on how much money you have, so there's a value of your estate. If that's over $15,000, and most people have at least that in their KiwiSaver balance today. So people think, I don't have a house, do I really need anything? Well, just also think about, most people have a KiwiSaver these days, and it's well, as soon as the markets improve a little bit, it should be growing. Is that Yeah, so what happens is that if it's over 15,000, then the Administrations Act will apply, and there's actually a predetermined formula in that act, that piece of legislation, that sets out what will happen. And so it will depend on, if you have a partner or a spouse, and if you have children, if your parents are still alive, if you have other family members that survive you and the like. And so there's kind of different formulas depending on your circumstances. What I would say, though, is that, those formulas said about it doesn't really think about blended families and other ways that families have evolved since those legislation has been put in place. And so really it's working through quite a formulaic process under that act, and you'll need to pay to go to court to have that act applied, so which is often, of course, much more expensive than what you will pay to put the will in place in itself. So you don't really understand the value of having a will until all of a sudden the worst happens. Of course, you might not be around, but you've really left your family and your extended whānau to deal with all of those issues and try and work that through.
Mm. Yeah, I've got to say, Tom, I think New Zealanders always love to compare ourselves against other countries. So when it comes to, this 50% of us having a will, 17% of us having enduring power of attorney, how do we look in these sorts of areas? Are we uniquely bad, or is this a common issue?
Yeah, from our experience, it's definitely something in common. I'm always impressed how a lot of people, they tend to engage with the idea of having a will when they start to travel overseas, and when you're about to head out for a big trip, you're like, oh, maybe I should put a will in place, especially if you're traveling with your partner. And this is the sort of thing where we're not just talking about keeping you on track for your goals, but keeping you on track for your goals for your family and your whānau. What would you like to have happen? What would you like your legacy to be? What would you, and lots of times, as Glenys says, we don't want to go near these questions at all, but they're really so useful. A will is so useful to keep you on track for what you really want to happen.
Mm. Absolutely. I mean, Dr. Aisha, I can imagine people sort of nodding along to these things and saying, yes, it is very important and we should talk about this, and then still pausing before they have these important conversations. Why is it so hard for us to talk about all of this?
Well, I think we're not great at talking about money in general. So if we are struggling to talk about the operational side of money or retirement planning, and we're not really thinking about what we're doing in a household and with our family and our extended whānau, anyway, to then add sort of what happens when I die, adds an additional layer of complexity. And to Glenys's point before, like New Zealanders, we just don't, we see money as a very taboo topic, and then death can seem a little bit morbid and even more serious and a bit of a downer to bring up. But I suppose my main thing for everyone to take out of this is it doesn't need to be like that. Money conversations and death planning can really be something that brings families together and builds intimacy in families and blended families, and all types of extended dynamics. And also, something that hasn't been mentioned is in New Zealand, there's a lot of family trusts. And so we do have quite complex, financial situations. And so it can get a little bit gnarly and a little bit complex. And thinking about all of these things and talking about all of these things when you are able to articulate what you would like, I think is what our family would want us to do, rather than having to not only grieve our loss, but also, try and think about and make all these decisions for us, and anything that might be complex along the way as well.
Oh, absolutely. And sometimes you think, people really well and you think you know what they want and you're not quite correct. I've had this difficult conversation with my mum and she wanted some things left to charities and then she specified absolutely nothing left to this particular charity and I was really surprised. It's these things can catch you by surprise and you would hate to think that you had not met someone's wishes once they've gone. Glenys, what is the process like? How do you get started in this area? And in terms of building up a will, getting going, it can be a little daunting, right?
Yeah, so look, in terms of taking the first step, there's lots of information that we provide on our website, and there's also a lot of information on other people's websites as well, like Sorted and the Law Commission. So there's lots of information that people can absorb. We also offer the opportunity for people to start to complete their will online, so you can work away at it in the comfort of your own home. And we have people that will support you through that process virtually, if you need it. But of course, you can also come in and see Public Trust or other lawyers or trustee officers, and get personalised advice face to face to guide you through the process. And we help you with tools and questions that help you to think about what are all the things that you really need to think about in terms of your will. I noticed in the chat, Francis, that some people were really talking about how do we stop, because I mentioned blended families, or in families we don't always all get along, or we have some disagreements. How do we stop people from challenging or think about all of those different dynamics in terms of creating our will? And this is where really, first and foremost, I would say, sit down with someone and get some advice about your particular situation. And there's a lot of questions and things to work through. I know when I first sat down to do my will, they asked me a question. I have a blended family. I have stepchildren and my own children. And when they asked me about that, me and my husband realised actually we needed to go away and think about this a little bit more than what we had, and come back. So often it can be a stepped process in terms of working through those. But that's the beauty of really engaging some professional advice, is that they'll help. We'll help you to work through what are all the things that you really need to think about.
Yeah, what are some common areas that people need to consider for this?
Well, I mean, the key thing if you're making a will is really thinking about not only what you want to have happen, but equally too, under the current legislation, you do have some obligations, particularly in terms of your children or stepchildren or the like. So it's really about how do you consider them in the writing of your will. Someone's also in the chat talked about, well, how can I stop my will from being challenged? How do I think about all of these things? Well, the key thing is that you need to work through a process where you're very clear about what you want to have happen and why. So if you want there to be unequal shares or maybe even someone excluded, getting advice around what are structures you could put in place to do that. But most importantly, that you're very clear on why you want to do that, because unfortunately, you can't actually stop someone making a claim against your will. Okay, I wish I could say to you, yes, you've got this airtight, watertight piece. You can't stop people challenging it. But the clearer you are about what you want to do, what you want to have happen and why, and that you've got advice around how you might structure that to get that outcome, then chances are, with that advice, you're going to be very clear so that if it is ever challenged or taken to court, your views and what you wanted to have happened, lives beyond you, if that makes sense. And it's very clear. So it would make it harder for someone to successfully challenge, if that makes sense. So I'm not going to say it's easy. There's lots to think about. But most importantly is that, the process does set you up with a series of questions. And I think you need to be prepared that some of those questions might be really hard, because it's not just even about what you want to have happen today, but how do you make that last for the future? Because of course we would all like to think that we're going to live a lot longer than when we're actually putting these things in place. So yeah, the first step though is leaning into the conversation and seeking out what are all the things I need to think about and questions I need to answer.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, Tom, there's been a few messages here around, you got to be clear, you got to let people know what you feel about these topics. And I feel like that is what it comes down to, right? Is it's a time for really clear communication. When you're looking at things like a will or also the power of attorney, what sort of things go into which box, and what sort of things will you need to communicate?
Yeah, overall, this is a really challenging area also because in the family, we come from entirely different backgrounds. If you think about it, even in terms of, you never have in a partnership two people who earn exactly the same or who came up in the same type of households. And recently we've been looking at the different households and how they were with some of these money issues, and they were either it was a taboo sort of subject that you never talk about these things. Every family has things that are off the table, like religion or politics, but money unfortunately tends to be, and especially long-term planning it never really comes up, and you really don't have two people who earn exactly the same ever, so their attitudes, their beliefs, their way of handling money is just completely different. But the benefits I really like to you brought up is that this is a way of fostering intimacy. This is great. That if you're able to broach the subject, if you're able to, and we've got different resources on Sorted for even when that conversation is breaking down, what to do if your partner says this, what to do if your partner says that. There's definitely support available in order to have these open conversations. What we want in our households is these an open verbal style, but also a very calm style emotionally too. If we could have those two things, then we have a secure environment to have a really fruitful conversation.
Yeah, and I think, Dr. Ayesha, is there a best way to have these conversations? Should we be, a classic is having a conversation in the car or over dinner, maybe, is there a way to broach this that makes it a little less intimidating and more likely to go well?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we want to prepare for success, right? So we want to make sure that everyone is sort of in a good place in that particular moment. So we're not coming in trying to have these really intense discussions, or maybe it will be really super easy, who knows, but not wanting to do it when people are tired, not wanting to do it when anyone is hungry or thirsty, or, but also normalizing these types of conversations. So you're not going from no money conversations or no serious, slightly taboo conversations, and then just going, right, we need a will, we need to do X, Y, Z, we're going to do it right now, just get it all sorted. You can work up to it in the way that everyone on this call wants everyone to rush off and do all this right now, but there is a way to lay the ground for success. And I would add to the suite of resources at Sorted and Public Trust, also the Healthy Financial Relationships Toolkit on Good Shepherd's site that we launched recently. If you are worried about having the actual conversation itself, then that can be a really good place to start laying that groundwork. All of the stuff that Tom was talking about, where we come at these conversations from two different places often, be that what we want to have happen, or how much money we're earning, our assets, blended families, slightly more complex, but additionally, just start small, start casually, but know that, you're getting somewhere. And, as Tom said, do it in a loving, respectful way. Everyone wants the best outcome out of these conversations. No one's looking for a fight. So just make sure that everyone is fed, well slept, and in a good position for this. And sometimes it means giving someone a little bit of warning that you want to talk about it, say, actually, this has been on my mind. I would like to have this conversation. When is a good time for you, so that we can sit down and actually talk about this? In the same way that you would approach any kind of important issue or, planning thing. A little bit of life admin can be boring. You may need a nice cup of coffee. You might need to jazz it up a little bit so everyone's excited about it. But yeah, certainly ways that you can make it more successful from the outset.
I think coffee always helps. I'm also a big fan of bribing with chocolate biscuits or whatever else you need. Glenys, we've had a few people send through somewhat procedural questions that I'd love to get your take on. I mean, things like literally, who should you talk to if you want to set up a will? Where do you go? And what sort of costs can you expect?
So obviously, Public Trust provides wills. We do that online from $69, so it's not potentially as expensive as what people might think. Obviously, that price may increase if you have got particularly complex circumstances. You can also come in and visit us as well, and get some personalised advice in terms of a face-to-face at one of our customer centres. You could go to a lawyer. There are also other trustee companies that offer wills and the like. And then equally, I certainly know some time ago there are some DIY that you can go and buy at Whitcoulls if you decide that that might also be something that you look into. Irrespective of which avenue you go to, is that you do need to get that witnessed in a certain way. So these documents need wet ink, and sort of some additional witnessing is quite key. So one of the questions I noticed too, Francis, was around, if I've got a will, can I just put a document with it to make updates as I go, and that would supersede the will? You still need to update the legal documentation, being the will, for it to be seen as, I suppose, witnessed and verified that these were your wishes. So whilst the document might be helpful in terms of understanding, it wouldn't be legally binding, if that makes sense, in terms of anything I might put with an original will. So I would encourage you to go and get updates, and those are equally fairly cost effective. In fact, through our online service, you can update that and keep working on it for free for a period of time, and then we have a much smaller fee for you to do regular updates, because things do change.
Mm. And we've talked about wills a lot, and they're of course really important, but a will versus enduring power of attorney, what is the different case for each of them? What do they cover? What do people need to be thinking about with each?
So with a will, that's really setting out what you want to have happen with your assets, your special sentimental things, who's going to look after your children, your pets after you die. An enduring power of attorney is who will look after me and make decisions for me about my health and well-being and my personal care, i.e. engage with doctors and medical professionals, and who will look after my finances if I'm still alive, but I can't make those decisions for myself. So an example being, unfortunately, my father has dementia. And so my mother has enduring power of attorney for my dad. And so that means that because she had those documents in place, he literally walked in to renew his driver's license at 75, failed the memory test, and that led to a diagnosis. So immediately couldn't drive anymore, and quite quickly was deemed medically not to have the capacity to look after his finances. Now, if mum didn't have that enduring power of attorney, so that immediately gave her access to his accounts to be able to do that. If you don't have an enduring power of attorney in place, then your whānau or a loved one, if you've got one to put their hand up to say, yes, I'll do that for you, would need to go to court to be appointed. So it can take a lot longer. In the meantime, really stressful because you're already dealing with a diagnosis and something challenging has happened in your life, that actually getting someone to have the legal ability to look after these things for you is another challenge added on top of that. So an enduring power of attorney is equally as important, and that's like your living documents. It's for while you're living. If something really bad happens, or you happen to get a cognitive illness or a brain injury that means that you can't look after yourself, then you've said, this is the person that I trust, that I want to, or the entity, like public trust, we do that as a professional service. These are the people that I want to make these decisions for me.
Mm. And Tom, we've referenced a few of the tools that are out there as well. I know Sorted's got a lot of tools to help people figure out what they want to do and even what they should be thinking about, what areas they need to look at. So walk us through some of the tools, the resources that you've got to help people think about this stuff.
Yeah, so we have a great collection of tools, guides, blogs on there. Are a few walking us through these areas. We have a 6-step program. Actually, if you're just getting started and are sorting out your financial life and don't know where to start, you can start with our 6 steps there. But this is particularly pertains to one of the areas of guides that we have on the protecting wealth area. And really, wills and power of attorney, they really come under that, where you're trying to protect your people. You know, a lot of people, we don't know where to start a lot of the times when it comes to insurances and all this. So we've tried to prioritize a little bit and just said, hey, cover your people, your money, and your stuff pretty much in that order. You know, put the people first. And wills and enduring powers of attorney, they're really about protecting the people in your life, and so that you can make sure that what you'd like to happen should you become incapacitated, you know, to make sure that it does happen. And it's a way, of loving those in your family and in your whānau, to make sure that things are prepared for them, that they don't get left in the lurch, and they can continue. When you think about what would make you most happy when you think about your immediate family and your whānau, is that they could continue with the minimal disruption, and that it would be relatively smooth sailing should the unthinkable, or the, as Glenys says, the highly predictable, if it happens. So that's that protecting wealth section on Sorted. We know in terms of goals that it's very easy to set short-term goals, and I think this is the way we think. Actually, it's just that it's much more in focus, isn't it? That we can set a goal for next year, or in the next few months, or 1 to 3 years. But we try to encourage people to have goals in 3 separate baskets, and 3 three separate buckets. So in 1 to 3 years, and then medium term 4 to 9 years, have some goals there. And of course, the long-term ones, 10 years plus. And when you start to have some goals in each of those buckets, and then you can start to give money a job to do, and then invest it accordingly depending on the time frame involved. So a lot of our goal setting materials have to do with those 3 time frames.
And if people are thinking about, I mean, I think sometimes this can feel a bit daunting for people. So if people are looking at one healthy money habit to start now, to sort of get the ball rolling on this and start making these changes, what would be one thing you'd recommend, Tom?
Well, obviously, with this conversation, the best thing to do to get started would be to have an open conversation. To start the conversation little by little. And I loved what Ayesha was saying, where actually you don't need to do it all at once. Have this mega conversation. You can work up to it, and not like in a manipulative sort of way. Hey, I'll get them to talk about this or something like that. But actually, just little by little. Okay, all right. Let's think a little bit about this. What would you want to happen? What do we want to happen for the kids? What when we think about these people we're close to, what is it we would hope for them should something happen? And just to start with those conversations, and in the chat, we've got the link to some of those resources that we were mentioning before. It can really help the conversation get started, get going, and then continue to talk about the real essential stuff.
Yeah. And Dr. Ayesha, a few people have sent through questions talking about, as Glenys mentioned earlier, the blended family issue. And I think that's tricky, right? So much of this comes down to those difficult conversations about how you want things handled, who matters, why, who's been in your family for the longest time. These are all things that come into play. So when you have a blended family, maybe one side has kids and the other doesn't. Someone has also mentioned, if I die before my partner, I want to make sure that they can stay in the house. Tricky conversations to have. So, do you have any tips for how to start those conversations that could ruffle feathers?
Yeah, so I mean, I think all the stuff that we've already talked about applies, but additionally, I think it's really key here that and it might be depending on the family dynamics, by the time you work up to the serious conversation with everyone in the room, like it could be fractious, it could be conflicted, but I think, as Glenys was saying, like lean into that almost, because I think ultimately, would you rather that you make your wishes clear when you are able to articulate them for yourself, or do you want to set everyone up for a fight after you're gone? And when we're talking about enduring power of attorney, like, do you want your kids or your stepkids or whoever squabbling over who gets to like have what say? I think these conversations, they might be unpleasant in the moment. They might be uncomfortable. It doesn't make them any less constructive. And it can be really telling, I think. But if you go in with, an open mind, an open heart, everyone is respectful, and you just say, look, this is what I want, and this is why I want it, and this is why we're setting it up this way. No one's going to get a shock after the fact, and I think that there can always be, someone contesting or someone's unhappy or whatever. But I think, as Glenys said, if you've made it really clear and you were careful and deliberate in how you set things up, then you're going to make it very hard for that person to make a case to a judge or whoever, and get their way, basically. So I think that it is worthwhile having these conversations. If there is a little bit of conflict, I mean, you can prepare for that, right? Like you can say, look, I know we don't usually all get along. However, this is important to me, and this is why I want to do it this way. In terms of, having the right to stay in the house, again, that is something that you can set up, and that is something that can be organized. And I'm sure that, most people, we're talking like almost everyone, you know, is going to probably be okay with letting the surviving partner in their old age stay in the house. You know, I'm sure that in most, like very few situations, it's going to be like unreasonable. So again, don't expect everyone to know what you want. No one can read minds. But if you say it and you make it clear, then it's going to be pretty hard for those step children and blended families to bicker right there in front of you, you know. And if they choose to bicker afterwards, then that's on them. But you did everything you could to make sure that it was easy for them, you know, to manage everything when the time comes.
Yeah, absolutely. And Glenys, you mentioned earlier about some of the questions coming through asking about, how you can update these things, what counts as an update, how you file it all. And I'd like to go into that into a little bit more depth because it's not exactly one and done, right? Your assets might change or your situation might change. You might want to update things for whatever reason. And we've had quite a few different varieties of this question come through. So I'm just going to try and mush them all into one question. But, at what stage do you need to involve a lawyer for, your will, for enduring power of attorney, or for updates? When do you need the legal people involved, and how much can you DIY this?
So look, I think first and foremost, what I'd say is you could do it all online if you wanted to. Like I said, we've got an online service that actually thinks about all of those things. What I would say is if you haven't thought about them, it could be quite daunting. So, we do often find people engaged through the online service, but then want to come in and talk to somebody because actually it's getting quite complex, or there were things that they hadn't really thought about that they wanted to talk to someone through about it. So it's difficult because there's no hard, fast rule, I suppose, Francis. It really depends on what people want to do and at what point they feel confident to engage personally and work through that process versus actually I want to sit down with someone and get some advice. What I would say is that if at any point you're in doubt, or is this really going to be, have I thought about everything, then sit down and get some advice is definitely the message I would give. I think that there is really helpful guides around what are all of the things that you need to think about before you start to lean in, whether or not that's coming along to an appointment to engage with somebody or to try something online. So there's lots of things or material available, and we've already talked about some of those resources about the types of questions that you need to think about. And equally too, if you're younger and you might not have children yet, we would encourage that you actually think about, well, what would you want to have happen if you did have children? Because then your will kind of considers that and plays out, okay, a scenario around, well, if I have children and what if I have grandchildren? So when I wrote my will, I don't yet currently have any grandchildren, but one day I might. And if I do, then it's already starting to consider, well, so what would that mean for grandchildren? Now, if one day I actually do have grandchildren, I might reconsider, or I might want to change, if that makes sense. But in the meantime, I have a hypothetical scenario that plays out. So those are the types of things that you're asked to think about. So even though it might not be your exact situation today, it could be in the future, and therefore let's play out those scenarios. And if that doesn't happen, or something else happens that you hadn't considered, those are the key trigger points around, oh, maybe I need to go and update or sit down with someone to see if I need to reconsider this, because family dynamics change. You might have written a will when you were in a previous relationship, for example, and now you're in a new relationship that has other children involved, and life can get pretty complex pretty quickly, speaking from experience. And so you've kind of just got to keep leaning into, okay, so what does this mean, and being really clear with people about it. And and I think the key thing is about being very clear around, look, this ideally is what I want to have happen. Family dynamics and relationships change over the course of our lives. Unfortunately, we do see scenarios where families have become fractious, or there's a relationship breakdown, and that can often lead to people wanting to make changes or the like. And so it's just really important that if anything like that's going on, come and have a conversation and get some advice, because there could be some unintended consequences if you don't do anything about it, or start to think about, okay, well, if this carries on the way it's going, then what am I going to do about it? So, whether or not that's sitting down in person or engaging online, I think it depends on your preference, but there's plenty of information available out there. And certainly we're always happy to sit down and have a conversation with anybody that's looking to lean into this space.
And you mentioned there about things can get a little fractious, and I think nobody wants that, but it does happen from time to time, and it's something that has been just touched on previously in this, but it would be great to get more thoughts from you on this. Estranged children or siblings that you don't want to make a claim against your assets, those are examples that have been sent through as questions to us. If you're wanting to exclude someone from your will for whatever perfectly valid reason that you have, is that difficult to do?
It's not necessarily difficult to do. Again, depends on your circumstances. There are different ways that we would give advice around how you might structure assets, for example, that would get the outcome that someone was looking to, which might be to exclude somebody who would usually have a claim against your estate. This is this key piece. So it's not necessarily difficult. I think what I said earlier, coming and getting some advice and being very clear and making sure that's well documented about what you're doing and why you're doing that and why it is your wishes, alongside having the legal structure in place, which could be a will. It could also be a trust within that will. So there's a lot of different legal structures that might support that type of outcome. That's certainly something that we would be able to help somebody with. The other thing in the question, someone sort of asked, is it better to have a family member as an executor or your enduring power of attorney? The thing that I would say is absolutely, you could choose anybody to be your executor, or it could be a family member, it could be a friend, to be your power of attorney. All I would encourage you to do is really think about what you're asking them to do. Equally, this is a key service that public trust or other professional trustees or lawyers will provide, which gives that element of independence. So, you're really asking those people to make key decisions. It can only be one person most of the time. So whilst you might have some people who might advise them, it is, ultimately the responsibility sits with one person. And I've certainly, in my experience, seen family members where one sibling has this obligation, and actually having really difficult conversations and the pressure of actually making the decision, for example, as an enduring power of attorney for personal care and welfare, making the decision not to resuscitate a family member. And that's coming not only are you have the weight of making that call, which is incredibly difficult, but being scrutinized by your siblings and having to justify that decision. That's the type of thing that you're asking those people to do. And so sometimes you absolutely want that to be a family member or a friend or the like, and that yes, they can do that. Other times you might want someone completely independent that can make quite a independent call on that. And I think that's another important key decision that you make as part of this process, which is quite fundamental to how things go after you're gone, or when you might be unwell. It's to Ayesha's point earlier, and having these conversations early, it'll help you to understand, okay, hold on, are they getting along? Are we all on the same page? And if not, then maybe I need to think about, well, how do I take the pressure out of that situation rather than put more pressure in, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And Dr. Ayesha, you mentioned earlier as well about our financial situation in New Zealand can sometimes be complicated. And you mentioned trusts as an example, and we have had some questions come through regarding those. Trust law has changed recently in New Zealand, just to keep us all on our toes. So the question that was sent through is, are family trusts beneficial to a will? I mean, that's probably a very big question to answer, but it can make things complicated, right? That would surely be a good reason to go and talk to someone and get advice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as soon as there's trusts, and I mean, I think now it's a perfect time because, as you said, the trust law has changed. Didn't change yesterday, but it has changed over the last sort of 12, 24 months. And that was on the cards for some time. And some of the transparency around family trusts has changed. I think that this is quite key for people who, as Glenys was saying, might have structured everything in a certain way to work alongside their, sort of normal will, and added. I was raised in Australia where family trusts aren't such a big thing. And so to me, I'm like, why would you make everything more complex? But there's very good reasons for having a trust, obviously. But New Zealanders do have a lot of trusts. Things have changed. Use that change as the prompt for having these conversations and for seeking, legal advice, be that from your lawyer or, public trust or whoever, because the conversations that you have to have with your beneficiaries have changed. What you need to disclose, when you disclose it, how you disclose it, all of that has changed. And if you have set things up in a certain way and circumstances have changed, you need to seek advice on that, because particularly when we're talking about, complex family dynamics, again, you want to be in charge of making these decisions to the best of your ability while you can make those decisions, rather than leaving it all to chance, after the predictable happens.
Yeah. And I think as well, Tom, there's a question that's come through here that is, this probably speaks to a fear that a lot of people have. Someone has sent through, if something happens to them, how can they actively ensure their children are cared for without having life insurance? They do have a will, they have enduring power of attorney already in place, but it's more how they should organize their finances to build wealth for their children once they're gone. I mean, that must be a huge anxiety for a lot of people. Where would you even start?
Yeah, I'll just mention that in terms of family trust, that's one of the most popular guides that we have on Sorted, but their effectiveness has changed in recent years, as Ayesha has said. But in terms of, well, obviously, like outside of life insurance, though, life insurance is a product that's designed for particularly taking care of those who you leave behind. But other structures you can look at. I mean, a will should really cover all of your investments that you've been building up over a lifetime, and each of those, just as in the everyday budgeting, you give each dollar a job to do, preferably in the long term, you'd give all of those assets that you have a job to do, and you really want to be prioritizing the well-being of families. So the question becomes, how can we engineer the most happiness out of these assets that are building up over time? And will, or an advanced directive, is a way of making sure that happens, even without all the conversations that we've been talking about that need to happen. A will can be put in place to make sure that those assets are all given a direction, given a job, and to make sure that the generations to come have the the most well-being out of them. A lot of our work on Sorted is really building those assets over time. So whether it's KiwiSaver or investing outside of KiwiSaver, building up property portfolio, there's all of these things. But when you think about what that's for, we're really advocating for people to improve their positions over the long term, engage in long term thinking. But it's not just to to build up net worth. Money is never just about maths. Money is really about well-being, and not just our personal well-being. Unfortunately, a lot of the early conversations about money get us focused on ourselves and being self-sufficient and things like that, and even which can come across as selfish. But really, what it's for is for our well-being, but for the well-being of those we're close to and the generations to come. So as we go ahead and that wealth builds, our money grows, then we really need to make sure that all of that is given direction so that it can continue without us.
Yeah, and it's a quick one here from one of our webinar guests. Glenys, I'll send this your way. What happens if you have a will but no one knows about it?
So if you have a will but you haven't told anybody, is that ultimately we have processes that we follow to go and search out wills. So if you've made one, you would have had to have, someone would have witnessed or the like. So if you've gone and got I think I also saw the DIY, I've gone and bought it at Wickles, and you've executed it by witnessing it, then at least one other person, if not two, knows that you've written a will. Okay, so they know. Now, the first thing I would say is there's absolutely no point in doing this if you don't tell people that you've got one. You don't need to tell them what's in it if you really don't want to, but just that you've got one and that where you've stored it, or that you've stored it somewhere safe, because that's the whole point. Now, it's highly unusual that they're not usually tracked down. So, usually after you pass away, people will search the highs and lows of your house to go and find it. First and foremost, sometimes that's easier. Other times that's a little bit difficult. People are really good at hiding things and keeping them safe. But most of the time, at least, if you've executed it properly, at least one or two other people know because they've witnessed it. And so, so it is unusual that you don't find it, but there's also processes that we go through to track down people's wills, because people might write more than one. It's not unusual with public trust. We might hold a will, but subsequently someone has gone and written another will with a lawyer or another entity or the like. And so it's trying to work out what's the most recent and which supersedes the other and the like. And so that's all part of the process after someone passes away that we work through to determine and find it. But I would absolutely recommend tell people that you at least have one and where you've stored it. And certainly if you write one with public trust, we often will keep the original on site in our fireproof safe. So that's another way that people know that it's safely secured and not going to get lost at home.
Fabulous. All right. Well, we are running up on time, but what I want to finish with is I'm just going to go around each of you and just say, if there's only one thing that people take away from this chat today, what would you like that thing to be? What is the big number one lesson? Glenys, let's start with you.
My number one thing would be, now more than ever, it's really critical that you lean into these conversations. We know that they're hard. Talking about our death, our money and what we have, and open ourselves up to judgment around, is that good or bad or the like, and really thinking about the future is hard. But from our experience, people that lean into this really do walk away with real peace of mind and a sense of knowing that actually they've done a really great thing for their whānau and their friends, that they've set themselves up. And like I said, it's now more critical than ever. We've got an aging population, more and more of either our friends and family or people that we really care about are entering into that over 65 bracket. And equally to, the value of property increasing the way it has, there's more at stake. And so if you're not really clear about what has happened, then you really are putting at risk that there is going to be conflict with your friends and family, and even without the conflict, there's going to be the stress of having to work through not really knowing, and working through quite a robotic process around that. So lean into it is what I would say. It can be really rewarding. So I'm not going to pretend it's easy. It can be quite hard, but really rewarding out the other side.
Tom, how about you?
Yeah, for me, it's long-term thinking. I always like to tell the kids that money is not just for spending, money is for growing. And so my favorite metaphor these days is sunflower seeds. We like to eat some right now, but saving some for the future allows you to grow, and even make sunflower oil for chips, which we love too over the long term. But the point is that as we're growing our position over the long term, and I'm glad Glenys mentioned the property market, because we're talking about a lot at stake, especially since what has happened after the whatever 14 years of a bull market. That over time, the more that net worth climbs, it's really not about the money or how well off we are, but it's really about how much well-being can we get out of that. And things like will, enduring powers of attorney, insurances in place, all allow us to that peace of mind, to stay on track, and to make sure that those assets that we've built up are really there for the well-being of those we're close to.
Dr. Ayesha, your turn.
So I'm going to take a slightly different track, and I am going to talk about kids, because I think that normalizing all of this stuff for our kids and our young people really empowers them to take this forward as we're sort of making these decisions, maybe for our parents and for ourselves, but also enabling them to have the skills to think through these things for themselves from quite a young age. So one of my favorite things, or most hilarious memories of my childhood, was my mum periodically taking me literally by the hand into the office and showing me where all the important paperwork was. And her whole thing was, my job is to make sure that when I die, where all the stuff is, where to find the lawyer's number. It for her, it was much more than how to use a washing machine and how to feed myself. It was about doomsday prepping effectively, and when you're a little kid, doomsday is like your parents dying, isn't it? So, but it's probably no accident that now I talking about money, because it is so important, and we can really normalize these most basic conversations that are really tied into our values and our well-being. As Tom said, money is a tool. It's not the be all and end all. But we certainly don't really want to be fighting about it. And we certainly don't want the people we love to be fighting about it. So let's get organised now.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I could keep talking to you guys about this all day, but unfortunately, that is all we have time for. Fantastic discussion. Thank you very much to our experts, Glenys Talivai, CEO of Public Trust, Tom Hartmann, Personal Finance Lead at sorted.org.nz, Dr. Ayesha Scott, Senior Lecturer at AUT Business School, and to everyone who tuned in and sent through questions, thank you very much for that. I hope the information today did help you. Have a lovely rest of your day and enjoy Money Week.
Thank you so much, Frances.
Yeah, thank you.